I want to tell you a little bit about this book tonight, and maybe read a paragraph or two. That's all. Give you a taste of it, and of course then take your questions to the extent that I can, and look forward to doing it. Now, as Sarah mentioned, this book covers a 30-year period when nothing much happened, just the run-up to the Civil War, which, you know, there were probably bookstores on the Civil War, never mind books, and then Reconstruction, just in case we haven't had enough after the Civil War. And one of the things that first struck me about the period was that there are a very odd group of characters, people, figures that come together at this particular time in history. Of course, there's Lincoln. One would expect Lincoln. One of the difficulties I had in this book, among many, was making sure Lincoln didn't take over, because he does have that tendency to do that, which I can understand why now. But it's not just Lincoln. You have an array of people: Lincoln, P.T. Barnum, Ulysses S. Grant, and all the other generals. You have Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, of course, Charles Sumner. Then you have the abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, newspaper editors like Horace Greeley, Harriet Beecher Stowe. You have Walt Whitman. Then you have people like Ralph Waldo Emerson. I mean, it's really quite John Fremont, if anyone who knows who Fremont the Pathfinder is. Sojourner Truth, Nathan Bedford Forrest, many people who know who he is, and I could go on and on and on. And as I say, these are very different kinds of people come together in a very strange moment in time, and all of them part of a period that, forgetting even the war, if you can, for a moment, just a moment, not to worry, but it's a time of tremendous innovation. And there are many, many innovations, technological innovations, for example, during this period of time. Think, for example, of photography. My dear friend Bob Wilson, who's just written a wonderful book on Matthew Brady, will be here next week, a little bit of advertising. But of course you want to spend your money on my book, but nonetheless he'll be here next week to talk to you more about photography. But I do want to mention it because it is such an important phenomenon in this period of time. Often people, or often I have wondered why the Revolutionary War period doesn't capture the imagination as much as the Civil War period, besides all the obvious fratricidal answers. It also, I think, has to do with there are no photographs. No one knows how anybody looked in that time. You do have painting, but no photographs. Think also then, leaving photographs behind for a minute, the expansion of the railroad, tremendous expansion of the railroad during this period of time. And during the war years, of course, helped move troops and munitions, giving an edge to the north, because the railroad had expanded much more in the north at that time. And that isn't even to mention the Transcontinental Railroad, which was finished after the war and linked up east and west. So that you have those technological innovations. At the same time, you have the creation, which really blows me away, the creation of a brand new religion, an American religion, namely Mormonism, about which we've learned quite a bit, it seems to me, in the last several years. It was a religion that started in, of all places, upstate New York, in an area called the Burnt Over District. Not a very pleasant name, but what that meant was that there were so many revivals in that area. It was as if a millennial fire had swept through the landscape, leaving it burnt over. Think, of course, too, which you've already thought of, you don't need me for this, of the widening anti-slavery movement. I mentioned William Lloyd Garrison. He famously burned a copy of the Constitution to protest its fatal compromise over slavery, which to him, he called it a covenant with death, and as his copy of the Constitution went up in flames, he said, so perish all compromises with tyranny, and let the people say amen. And if that weren't enough, think of women's rights, of course. We want to think of women's rights. Women were often even before this period, early anti-slavery advocates, and as we see, or as we come to understand a very difficult question of why black men and neither black women or white women got the vote, in the period right after the war is really shocking. And in recent times, it seemed to me that the relentless pitting of women against black men was a feature certainly of the 2008 presidential race, when Hillary Clinton faced Barack Obama. Whatever you thought of either or both of them, you could see that certainly they each had enemies that were happy to make this context something that it wasn't necessarily. Then, of course, think of the issue of law. The issue of law and the defying of law and the innovation of law. Certainly the Fugitive Slave Act with its terrible moral pitfalls. The Fugitive Slave Act was allowed southern slaveholders to go north and in search of fugitive slaves and bring them back down south. And of course, this was also then a period that pushed against the law. It's a period of civil disobedience. And you think of certainly Thoreau and civil disobedience a little bit earlier, but there were many people who refused to return fugitives to slavery and actually helped men and women escape, and were, in that sense, willing and capable, to a certain extent, of taking the law into their own hands for good and for ill. It culminates, one way of seeing the culmination is to think about John Brown, and that's why I say for good or for ill, because I'm not sure, I know what I think of him, but I don't know what you do. So this was a time when you felt you could change anything you wanted, even the law, even if you didn't do it legally. And you also felt that you could do anything you wanted in terms of poetry and prose, not just politics, but politics and prose. That is to say that you could be as unconventional as you want. Think Walt Whitman, think the kind of poetry he was writing, which was shocking to many people, with its mention of unmentionable body parts and the way people smelled and things like that. And think also of Emily Dickinson, the poet who nobody was reading because she wasn't publishing, also a tremendous innovator. Think of Herman Melville, who torpedoed his career with his book Moby Dick in 1850. He'd been a bestseller, and then he wrote that, and that was the end of him until the 20th century got revived. So there was a kind of sense of optimism and idealism, and as I said, you could change everything. Even the darker writers of the period, like Hawthorne, participated for a while in Brook Farm earlier than this period. But certainly what it says to me, what this said is this time of tremendous expectation and tremendous failure. And it was a boisterous, expansive, greedy, strange time. One of the things I learned doing this book is that the Gilded Age actually started much earlier than we thought, because it was a time of, as I said, tremendous avarice as well, and American insularity, sort of thinking about America. To me, that was best exemplified by the laying of something called the transatlantic cable in 1858, which is just what it is. What the United States was trying to do was make contact with England and therefore Europe by laying a cable so that President Buchanan at the time could say hello to Queen Victoria. I don't think they had much more than that to say to one another, which was fine, because as it turned out, weeks after the cable finally was laid, the signal got fainter and fainter and fainter. And even though there had been celebrations all through America of the transatlantic cable, America becoming part of the world, there was such excitement, say in New York City, that the fireworks set set the cupola atop the city hall ablaze, and the statue of Justice tumbled to the ground. So, you know, the sort of symbolic there in the sense of, guess what's coming, a war. And moreover, that's what I meant about insularity. There was no more signal. You couldn't get that signal to work again until after the war. America had to turn inward and really take care of its own. And one of the things its own was the tremendous problem with slavery, the issue that had been vexing the nation since its founding. How I got to do this book, the background of the book I've in some sense alluded to. One is that I had written a biography of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who inhabited, as I said, the same moment that we're talking about. And I think Hawthorne not only inhabited the same moment as Lincoln, he actually met Lincoln, which always seemed odd to me because even though I grew up in New England and my father was from Salem, Massachusetts, I always thought of Hawthorne as a kind of 17th century character, you know, wearing a dark cape and kind of slinking around the streets. And here is a quintessentially 19th century man who came down to Washington, met with Lincoln, went out to Manassas to see what wasn't happening out there at that particular time. So that seems so interesting and so odd to me. And one of his very best friends, if not his best friend, was Franklin Pierce, one of the worst presidents, and he has a lot of competition. And Pierce was, among other things, more or less a Southern sympathizer. So I used to think, well, this is as if J.D. Salinger, Hawthorne, was friends with Bill Clinton, one of the most sociable kind of presidents ever. So it was an odd kind of combination. And then, so I was thinking about this. Well, what kind of period is this, really? And then I went from there to write a book about called White Heat that Sarah nicely mentioned, and it was about the relationship between Emily Dickinson. You know who she is. If you don't know who Higginson is, which most people didn't or don't, he was an abolitionist. He was a perfervid abolitionist. He was so serious about abolition that after the war broke out, first he didn't want to have anything to do with the war because he didn't think the war was being fought to end slavery. He thought it was just being fought to save the Union. Who needs to save the Union if you're going to keep slavery? But when he realized that it was perhaps going in a different direction, he was thrilled to get the commission to be the leader of the first federally authorized black troops in the United States in South Carolina, which, if he'd been caught, was curtains for Higginson. So he was a very brave man. And he was a kind of man who really put action where his beliefs were, which is bizarre when you think of Emily Dickinson up in Amherst, Massachusetts, having a almost 25-year friendship with this man. Again, these strange characters coming together in this historical moment, and I thought, what is this about? And in fact, I wondered about it so long that, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but Dickinson actually gives the title to the book. Ecstatic Nation comes from one of her poems that I use in the frontispiece there. So I thought, this is an ecstatic nation. This is an ecstatic moment where people believe anything can change, whatever the idea is, whether it's for a new religion, a new salvation, whether it is for freedom, as the abolitionists felt, whether it is for lawlessness on the side, whether it's of John Brown or later of the guerrillas who fight during the war and then after the war, or whether it's people who are frantic about keeping things as they are and were. One of the things that happened in the South during Reconstruction. And so it was a complicated story. That I knew. And I knew it was a complicated group of people who didn't necessarily seem to fit in the same moment. But of course, they did. They very much did. So the next thing I thought is, what am I going to do? Now what do I do? I mean, how do I confront this story? How do I tell this story? How do I approach the period? And I decided to do it as though I were from Mars. Was it women? No, they're not supposed to be from Mars, are they? They're supposed to be from Venus. In this case, so I was from Saturn. And just occurred to me, I don't want to be from Mars. But I don't, so I'm from an outer space. And I'm coming to touch down in this particular period. Take a date, 1854, 1857, whatever it happens to be. And I'm going to read the major newspapers of the day. And I'm going to try to figure out how various topics relate to one another. And the reason that I am saying this is because it actually occurred to me, I read the paper at home. I don't read it on a device. I actually read the physical paper. I still like to do that. And I'm always intrigued by either the front page or even when you open it up and you've got the, pages 2 and 3. And I'm always intrigued. I see you have a paper there, and I wish I had thought to do this before. See the kinds of things, the kinds of things that you would see on a front page, and how do they go together? This is the New York Times. Judge rejects New York stop and frisk policy. Arms shipment seen from Sudan to Syrian rebels, much ado about who really is Shakespeare, and something about health care. All right, makes sense to me, thank you. Sort of. No, but seriously, but if I were coming from my planet, would I understand how those things are connected? I understand. I know who Whitey Bulger is, and I know what healthcare is, and I know where the Sudan is, and I live in New York, so I know about something. Fine. But what if I didn't come from here and now, what are the connections that I would make? And I would begin to look at newspapers, which, I like to do. I mean, older newspapers. And I would ask questions. What, for example, did the rise of the Mormon Church have to do with the Lincoln-Douglas debates? There was a crucial moment in the history of the Mormon Church that occurs right at the same time as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Buchanan at the time was thinking of, sending troops into Utah. I thought, what? You see, what's the relation? And I remember exactly where I was. And it was driving me crazy. And then suddenly it occurred to me, because I kept reading and reading, oh, I know. I think I know. And that is popular sovereignty, the issue of popular sovereignty. That was the issue that Douglas and Lincoln had problems with, because Douglas was basically kind of a libertarian in a way, saying, listen, you can vote up. You can vote slavery up or down in the territories. You just decide. People should decide, right? I mean, it's just a question of popular sovereignty. You're sovereign. You're the people. That's Douglas's point of view. That wasn't Lincoln's point of view at all. And I realized that Mormons, of course, are arguing popular sovereignty. If they want to say, for example, and I'm not saying they did, but let's say they wanted to say, we believe in polygamy, and we all believe in polygamy, and it's a free country, isn't it? In that sense, so that we can vote for polygamy, you see, in that particular. That was really the underlying issue, which also suggested to me that the underlying issue was really slavery. That's what everybody was talking about, in a way, and it became dressed in different guises. But those were connections that I wouldn't have been able to, that took me a while to be able to make, that I think a reader of an 1858 newspaper, whether they were in the West or in the East, would have known more about. For another example, what did P.T. Barnum, everybody knows Barnum is, what did he have to do with Abraham Lincoln, or either of them have to do with Walt Whitman? You see, because they're all, again, in the same historical moment. And then it dawned on me that Whitman lovers, hold on, that Whitman is the Barnum of poetry, right? I mean, in a sense, he is. He says, oh, everybody come in and, and buy my book. And he uses all kinds of advertising and promotional devices, even printing a private letter that Emerson sent to him to advertise his first edition of Leaves of Grass. And they are in the same moment, and they knew each other. Actually, Whitman interviewed Barnum for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. So you see what I'm saying in that particular way. One wouldn't necessarily make these kinds of connections. Why was spiritualism in vogue before the Civil War? I'm just giving you some of these kinds of questions, but I'd always thought, after the war, so many dead, almost 750,000, and the number seems to keep rising. Of course, spiritualism be in vogue. I would want to get in touch with my, husband, father, brothers, whatever. But no, it was before the war. 1848 is the time that the Fox sisters in upstate New York, where all the weird things start to happen, start hearing rappings, and they start interpreting in them in that particular sense, and making contact in that way. Or what did a disaster in Lawrence, Massachusetts, called the Pemberton disaster, which was at the time the worst United States industrial disaster ever. Of course, this was 1860. There have been others. But what did that have to do with, on the one hand, Lincoln, on the other hand, slavery? Well, slavery quite a bit, actually, because the Pemberton disaster becomes something that is discussed at length in Congress, and it's discussed at length in Congress because the North and the South are pointing fingers at one another, and the Southerners are saying, see, look at how you treat your workers. We treat our slaves much better than you treat your workers. More questions. What, if anything, did Reconstruction have to do with the ultimate decimation of the Indians? Was there a relation? It happens at the same time. I always thought these things were consecutive because that's how I was taught history. They're not consecutive. They're simultaneous, and it's crazy, you see, and it's very difficult to figure out how you're going to compose a narrative then out of this once you begin to ask questions and see the connections underneath all of these kind of examples. And so then what I wanted to do as much as possible is create a fresh narrative, give you a path through things that would help you to see these kinds of connections in ways that you may not have predicted. For example, I'll give you a couple of examples. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the woman named Lydia Maria Child. Again, growing up in New England, I'd always heard she's related to the poem, or whatever it was, Jingle, I don't know what it is, over the hill and through the woods to grandmother's or grandfather's or somebody's house we go. I don't even remember. But you know what I mean? She was an incredible abolitionist. She was against the destruction of the Indians. She was on the side of truth and goodness and beauty and all that kind of stuff. And when John Brown was in jail in Virginia after Harper's Ferry, she wanted to come down and be his nurse. The woman was in her 50s by then. And John Brown wisely said, no, thanks. Thanks anyway. Thanks anyway. So what she did is she started correspondence with Governor Wise, the then governor of Virginia, and she started tangling with Senator Mason, also of Virginia, Senator Mason's wife, about John Brown in the newspapers. Sold lots of newspapers. Those were the days, went into pamphlet form with Child saying, they go back and forth, you're doing this. These women fighting over really John Brown. Who would have thought in that particular way? And Child, Lydia Maria Child, was a great line I thought she had. I think her final line to Mrs. Mason was, because Mrs. Mason was saying, well, we help, the slave women and we help the mothers. And Lydia Maria Child says, for in the North, after we've helped the mothers, we don't sell the babies, So that was a level of discourse, if you will, in that sense. So as I'm saying, I was trying to get different people in a different kind of narrative, particularly because often I do believe that history is embodied, that we can't really necessarily know events unless we know who's involved in those events, who participated, and what those events meant to the participants. Another example, Lincoln's assassination. I said Lincoln threatens to take over any book that he's in because he's so eloquent, he's so marvelous, he's so tall, he's so many things. So that what happens in Ford's Theater. Okay. So I don't want to do that again. How many times can you do it? You can milk a lot probably from it. So I took a different angle. I wanted to deal with the trial of the conspirators, and I wanted to juxtapose that with the trial of a man named Henry Wirz, who was the only person who was executed after the war for war crimes. Only one person, which is interesting in that sense. So there were several various stories. I won't tell you all of them. Just one more. there's another way I went about this too, and it's the way I go about everything actually. And it's I think I was miseducated. I think we all were, but it doesn't set right with me. And one of the things that I always think about is, was this person really like that, or did this happen this way in the way that I was taught? And one of the people that I was most interested in that context was a man named Thaddeus Stevens, who was played by Tommy Lee Jones in Spielberg's movie Lincoln. And even there, where he's supposed to be sympathetic, I thought he looked like a jerk there too. But he was a nicer jerk than the one that I had been told in high school, that he was a terrible man, horrible. And it was he and his ilk who had been responsible for the failures, to the extent that it failed, the failures of Reconstruction. It kind of bothered me because they said other things about him, making fun of the fact that he limped and things like that. So I did some investigation of him, and just to summarize, he's a complicated character, make no mistake. But one of the things you learn about someone like Thaddeus Stevens is that before he died, he was ill. He knew he was going to die, and he had bought a plot, cemetery plot for himself in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then he found out that the cemetery was segregated. It wouldn't let black men or women be buried there, and he refused to be buried in that particular cemetery. And he had written on his tombstone, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited by charter rule as to race, I've chosen it that I might be able to illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his creator." It's really very touching, whatever D.W. Griffiths or Steven Spielberg said about him. He's a very, very unusual man. So that's how I came to the narrative, and then, of course, there's the issue and the difficulty of actually making the narrative. And there are two examples that I want to give you in that particular context. I began the book, to my mind, in two places, although consecutively it begins in one place and then goes to another. Initially, I was going to, and the first chapter does begin with an expedition to Cuba. And the simplest reason for that choice is that I never saw a book about this period begin in Cuba. Who cares about Cuba, right? I mean, but it was like the Bay of Pigs. What happened was that there were a group of men who did this more than once called filibusterers. The word doesn't refer to our friends in Congress speaking a lot, but rather to these unlawful, speaking of law, expeditions where, in this particular case, Narciso Lopez and his one expedition had 600 guys in it, 600 men who joined him, young men, adventurers, freedom fighters, who knows what they were all there for, money, lots of reasons, who were going to invade Cuba and release it from the Spanish, because the Spanish owned Cuba. That sounds good. That's the freedom fighting part. And then, of course, annex it to the United States and make it a slave state. It's like, what? And this didn't happen just one time. This happened several times until finally government in the United States really got wind of this, and they blew the whistle to the Spanish. And, of course, the Spanish were waiting for Narciso and the guys, and that was the end of that. However, I thought that this really, I think, tells you something about the hemisphere in which we live, the need to extend, or the desire to extend, the reach of slavery, and about about a narrative, as I said, that begins where you wouldn't expect it, but is as relevant today as it was then, and it may have been bypassed. Then I thought of something else, and I put that first in the prologue. And what that was, before we go to Cuba, we do go Washington. We start in Washington, actually, and we go to the House of Representatives, where John Quincy Adams, the man, he's in the House at this particular time. He's 81 years old, and he seems to be the last living link with the founding fathers, where he dies. He dies in the House, actually, and he dies. It's so interesting. He dies shortly after, it's not causal, but it's dramatic, shortly after voting no, one of the few people who vote no, he votes no because he doesn't want the generals from the Mexican War, which he also opposed, knowing that it was going to be a slippery slope down the path to slavery. He voted no against the Mexican War. Now he was voting no because he didn't want to drape these particular generals in medals, thinking that that would just glorify more war, more expansion, more controversy. He said no. And it's so interesting to me because, as Emily Dickinson would say, no is the wildest word we have in the language. And so there's a one way in which the book that I've written is really about the end of that era, 1848, and the beginning of a new one. But it's also about no. It's about the political and cultural wages, or the political and cultural ability, the political and cultural consequences of saying no, really. Resisting, changing the status quo, confronting the issue of slavery once and for all, changing the status of women to the extent that it was changed in this particular period. They didn't get the vote, in case you didn't know, until 1920. Changing the literary and geographic landscape. There was a poet, Charles Olson, who once said, you know, America, I take America to be about space. Space is the central fact. To man born and woman born in America, I spell it large because it comes large and without mercy. And of course, as I'm saying, that there are saying no sometimes puts one above the law, and there are questions about when and why one should do that. And so I'm also saying, in that particular context, ecstasy and that kind of ecstatic nation has its costs. To summarize, and then I'll be glad and much happier in many ways to listen to you, let me just read a couple of paragraphs at the end of this prologue. The present was, and the future would be also, a time of delirium, failure, greed, violence, and refusal. Refusal to listen and to find or to create that hard common ground of compromise. Refusal to bend. So great was the fear of breaking. Refusal to change and refusal to imagine what it might be like to be someone else. John Quincy Adams knew how to say no, but that negative could be inflexible, ideological, fanatical, particularly when some considered refusal a better tool than compromise, or when compromise itself was so flaccid and unjust as to be meaningless, particularly if it evaded matters of human rights and dignity. In short, America was an ecstatic nation, smitten with itself and prosperity and invention, and in love with the land from which it drew its riches, a land grand and fertile, extending from one sea to another, and to which its citizens felt entitled. Yet there was a problem, a hitch, a blot, a stain. The stain was slavery. That John Quincy Adams knew, and because of it, he forecast with doom the price the country would have to pay. Some of the people in many of the events in this book are so familiar they seem ready-made. Lincoln and his grief-stricken face, the Confederate General George Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, the elegant and battle-weary Robert E. Lee meeting the scruffy, cigar-smoking, and oddly gentle Ulysses Grant at Appomattox. But the richness and variety of American life during this time of confidence and crisis and putative consolidation bring into focus other events, other characters. The impounding of the schooner Pearl as it tried to flee Washington, D.C. with a boatload of fugitive slaves. The day hungry women ran through the streets of Richmond begging for bread during the war. Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton riding on wagons without springs through Kansas to secure the ballot for women. Exuberant men, such as Walt Whitman and P.T. Barnum, embracing multitudes, the anguished honesty of Herman Melville, the powerful editor Horace Greeley changing his political stripes, the execution of the Lincoln conspirators and the head of Andersonville prison, and then the impeachment of a president. Anna, not Emily Dickinson, on the stump, Chief Red Cloud at New York's Cooper Union, the saga of the anti-slavery General Rufus Saxton, fired from the Freedmen's Bureau by a soon-to-be disgraced chief executive, and the grandeur and allure and promise of freedom, whether to the Mormons or to men such as Clarence King, who possessed nature in the wild, or so he thought. And then there was the war, the terrible war, and all the while before, during, and after it, the idea of compromise which was being bandied about, debated, and often held responsible for the country's failure to face its fatal flaws, for its selfishness and short-sightedness, and for the reconciliation at the end of Reconstruction that opened a new era beyond the scope of this book, thank God, of Jim Crow. I don't presume to say what people should or should not have done, which is not to suggest I'm without judgment, sorrow, or at certain times astonishment. Still, by placing persons, events, contradictions, principles, and yes, compromises next to one another, perhaps we can empathize with the choices people may or may not have felt they had, given the exigencies within which they lived and the very mixed motives we come to understand, if we do, but through a glass darkly. For in the roiling middle of the 19th century, when Americans looked within, not without, there was an unassailable intensity in imagination and exuberance, inspirited and nutty and frequently cruel or brutal. There was also a seemingly insatiable and almost frenetic quest for freedom, expressed in several competing ways for the possession of things, of land, and alas, of persons. And in many instances, there was a passion, sometimes self-righteous, sometimes self-abnegating, for doing good, even if that good included, for its sake and in its name, acts of murder. Thank you.
I should say, I come from Massachusetts. I went to public school. I had exactly the same reaction to Thaddeus Stevens.
Maybe we were in the same class, yeah.
As soon as I saw Lincoln, the movie, I went to Wikipedia, because this wasn't the Thaddeus Stevens that they had taught me, and I realized that Southerners must have written our textbooks, because I got the same impression that he was a terrible person.
They weren't Southerners that wrote those textbooks. No.
They
it was
were
Northerners.
They were Southern sympathizers, whoever they were.
Well, anyway, your question, go ahead.
American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
I wondered if you had a sense of it in this book. I'm a physician. I mean, our healthcare system looks like none of the other advanced countries. That's American exceptionalism. I don't think it's so great. But I was wondering how it came, if it came through to you in a book like this.
Not in the way that we come to think of it today. I know exactly what you mean. And there was a sense in which America at the time thought of itself as exceptional. And I took that word out because of the exceptionalism ring that it has to it. It thought of itself as different, and it thought of itself as possessing seemingly infinite resources, technological capabilities, innovation, best government ever, with a few problems. And in that particular way, it saw itself as a kind of vanguard of freedom. And I didn't mention, but I could have mentioned 1848 as a very complicated time, not just because Quincy Adams died, but there were revolutions going on in Europe that seemed to promise freedom. And when they failed, many of those immigrants German in particular, came to the United States to settle because they participated in, and then got into government, some of them, in that notion that America was different, it was special, it was better. So in that particular way. But thematically and as a kind of organizing device, not really. There were other things that concerned me more at this time, although the seeds of what you're talking about are certainly there. And they're probably there even earlier.
Thanks.
Thank you. Over this way. Hi.
Could Reconstruction realistically, conceivably, have played out differently, or were the objectives just too much to expect from either the southern population or the northern population at that time?
You know, in some ways, I hate answering questions like that. You know, I was just telling Sarah, somebody last week or this week, I don't remember anymore, asked me if England won in the Revolutionary War, would there have been slavery in the United States? And, you know, I don't know. And in that particular case, you know, part of me wants to say, I don't know if it could play out differently because it didn't. However, yes, I think it could have. But not for the reasons that we were taught. In other words, one of the things that became fascinating to me is to the extent that it succeeded as well as failed, Reconstruction. I wanted to say at the end of the book, you know, just a kind of coda, you think, or at the very end of the book, you think this was bad, what you just read about? Wait till the next 20 years, it gets really worse in some sense. There were tremendous gains made for great numbers of people, particularly the former slaves, in the South during this particular period. Could it have played out differently? What you had were impasses and I hate to say it because it's so contemporary, but you have such log jams in Washington, and you have the Republican Party, not the same as today, but the Republican Party then, the party of Lincoln, really party of Lincoln, splitting off. And actually the seeds of the present day political parties are born then. And so why it failed and how it failed is very, very interesting. Part of the reason it failed was money. There was a lot of money going into the South, and nobody really was kind of watching how it was necessarily being sold, and there was more money in the West. So the interests of the country turned to the West. So as I'm trying to say in an encapsulated and inarticulate moment, yes, I think there could have been other choices because there was so much going on at the particular time, and particularly in terms of politics. Who owns Reconstruction, the executive branch or the legislative branch? You see what I'm saying? So that there were so many things to put the failure on the, put it on the radical Republicans is, I think, really not what happened at all. But it is complicated, and who knows, because what happened, you know, there's in thinking about history, you have to think about it two ways simultaneously. One is you have to think as if you don't know what's going to happen, so that you're open to the possibilities. But the other way you think about it is that what happened did happen, and there was a kind of almost, you have to take that for granted in a way. So it's complicated. But the short answer is, yeah, I think so. Now you're there, okay. Sorry.
You mentioned German immigration. Of course, this is a period when there was a great surge of Irish immigration to the United States. Do you touch at all on the struggle that they confronted against Catholicism and how they fitted into a country that was on the brink and then immersed in a terrible war?
Yes, I mean, there's two things. One is that the rise of what was called the Know Nothing Party, which was called, it was also called the American Party. Excuse me, it was a nativist political party, and so it set itself against Catholics, which is to say against particularly the Irish immigration, because so many Irish were coming into the United States, and that party didn't. It failed, I mean, obviously, and so, I mean, we know historically that it did. But where we see the real clash, less in sort of political parties, but on the streets, is in the 1863 draft riots in New York City, where the element, the war, the Democrats, the Republicans, the war Democrats, the peace Democrats, you know, the Republicans, the Irish, the blacks, they all come together in a terrible moment of violence and horror. And that particular incident in history encapsulates, it seems to me, the kind of prejudices that were the way in which I think the Irish immigrants themselves were exploited, the kind of prejudices they themselves had, and the kind of larger world in which they became players or pawns.
I can't let the Reconstruction go by without asking if you entered the note that President Grant, at the end, after he retired from the presidency, said the only way the Reconstruction could have succeeded was if the southern states had been brought in first as territories.
That's right. He did say that. That was sort of in retrospect, and you're right. He was after the presidency in a way, and hindsight is always clearer. Grant is a complicated figure, and my own feeling is I think he was trying to do. Let me put it this way: I think that Grant did not want to squander any of the gains that had been fought for and that he'd lost so many men for after the war. He did not want to squander anything, and that he really believed that in many cases that the South should be divided into military districts and that the military should administer them. But he came smack dab in confrontation with Congress, who would have nothing to do with that. And so he was in a very, very difficult situation because his political skills were they were hampered. I mean, he wasn't allowed to develop politically in the ways he wanted to, I think, in certain senses. But I think that that might have done something, but it would have had to have happened in 1865, right after the war. You can't sort of send these soldiers down there, in 1867, 68, 69. It's too late. You've lost your moment. And what happened in 1865, you might remember. I remember like it was yesterday. Lincoln was shot, and Andrew Johnson took over. And Andrew Johnson's a piece of work. I mean, he makes Franklin Pierce look like, I don't know, Mahatma Gandhi.
The influence that occurred during 1861 to 1865 was part of a worldwide change, along with starting in 1848. The Europeans, and you go through the litany of countries that were, quote, savages, and over time changed their positions. Now, when I say change position, I mean technology changes and other things. Mm-hmm. And how does the Civil War place itself between the old structure of, say, Thomas Jefferson and the later structure of, say, 1920? I mean, are we talking about something that was common, not just to the United States, but to the entire world? And there are many different issues, so it's just a generalized question. But does not the entire world change at a certain pace, and some catch up sometimes and others lay back?
Well, to the extent, and I don't think you were intending this, but the way I hear the question, because I think you're talking about political things as much as technological, but to the extent that what I hear in your question, or the answer that comes to my mind is, you're talking about the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution begins before 1848 and sort of goes on for quite a while. And you're right, different countries change at different paces and in different ways. And when Charles Dickens came to the United States, he thought, this is great, the factories here are so nice, and everybody's happy, and so forth and so on. Not if you were at Pemberton when they said that the struts broke like sticks of candy and people were jumping out windows. It was terrible in that way. So there are different paces for technological advances. The Civil War, to what extent it played a role here, was enormous, really enormous, because of the railroads, because you have an industrializing North really becoming more and more predominant, because lots of people made lots of money. And then the money kind of fantasy, or the fantasy of making more money, continued. So I think that it definitely changed here. In terms of, I'm not competent to say the different paces at different times. And I'm not by any means saying it was a good thing either. I mean, change quite a cost, $750,000 if we're lucky, or so in that particular. But I think it's the Industrial Revolution. I think everything was changing. You're right.